Now, the wonderful Adina will teach you weird questions to ask about single sign-on, so you can configure it well instead of worse. This talk will be recorded and translated. I wish you a lot of fun with Adina.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the warm welcome, everyone. So I'm here to talk about single sign-on because I work at a big company, and my experience is basically as the person who translates between the people who do the real work and the IT people who try and support and make sure that we have the software that we need. So I'm really used to translating across that space. And yeah, that's the perspective that I'm coming from to give this talk. So it's very kind of business focused, but I think that it's probably something that even hackerspaces or even individuals maybe can learn something from as I go through the story of how things might fail if you don't necessarily ask the right questions. So, whoops, wrong button. There we go. So why am I giving this talk? So I found out through my experience of implementing single sign-on at a couple, or with a couple of applications at work, that if you do things wrong and you implement things really badly, you can feel like things are good because you've checked that box off of your compliance checklist. SSO is turned on. My identity provider is controlling access, so it's great. But it can actually just hide the scary things that are going on underneath the hood in a way that's maybe even worse than it was before if you haven't asked the right questions. But I don't want to leave you down in the dumps. So like I said, I think that questions are a superpower. And if you leave this talk with a few questions in your back pocket and the idea that you should ask all the questions that you might think are stupid, I think that you'll be in a much better place. Because asking those questions will let you clarify all those weird little things that maybe actually aren't working the way you expected. So, I said this is a beginner's guide to single sign-on misconfiguration, which means I should say, what the heck is SSO anyways? What am I even talking about here, right? And why does your company want it? So, as you do, when you need a definition, you go to Wikipedia, or at least I do. Thank you, dear Wikipedia contributors, for this definition, which says, single sign-on is an authentication scheme that allows a user to log in with a single ID to any of several related yet independent software systems. Okay, that's still maybe confusing if you're a real beginner. So what does it mean? In this case, it means I want people to be able to come to my company and just sign in at my company and then be able to access all of my company's stuff, whether it's hosted on our own on-prem systems, systems that we operate directly, or any software as a service or other things. I just want people to sign in once and get all the company stuff that they need. And why do you need this? So in the past, and this could be your house for your own stuff, and this could be your hackerspace, you would have a building, and everything that you owned, whether it was data or computers or compute, all of that was in that one place, and you had a key to get into this building, and you might put someone in front of the door and say, only the people I want in can come in. So it was very kind of organized. You could figure out who had access and who didn't. But we don't live there anymore. So now you just might still have some stuff that's actually in your building, that's on-prem or that's completely controlled by you. But what is this strange cloud situation? And who's controlling these ladders to get access to it? Well, if we zoom into the cloud, then we can see what single sign-on is meant to do. So you have this cloud stuff up here, and you want to figure out who has access. So instead of just letting the cloud people control the cloud access, you're going to put your company's door in front of those ladders, so everybody has to go through you to get to the cloud stuff, which seems kind of great. You're sort of getting the pros of the on-prem stuff while still getting the pros of being able to control who accesses your information. So what's the dream of single sign-on? Well, it offers a whole bunch of great things if it works out properly, right? You can centralize managing users. So if it's just you yourself and you're using single sign-on in a bunch of places, you only have one account to worry about and to manage security settings on. If you're a company, in my case, let's say my colleague Bob left the company yesterday. Instead of having to go to all 17 different services that we have and shut Bob out of all 17 of them, I can just shut Bob out of my company, and Bob can't access any of them, because in order to access all those services, he'd have to go through me. That's how it should work anyways. It should make life easier for you and your colleagues. I'm sure you all have great password managers, we're at Congress, and everyone is using strong and unique passwords, and they're never reusing things, and they definitely don't have a text file on their desktop with all their passwords, and they definitely don't just use their work Windows password for everything, right? And I'm sure none of your colleagues would ever consider doing terrible things like that either, right? Well, if you use single sign-on and you implement it everywhere, then instead of having to remember 17 passwords, they only have to remember one good one, and that should be easier, even though it's not trivial. That in itself is hard. But if you're only remembering one, maybe we can ask people to have good password hygiene. If you use single sign-on, then you can also enforce consistent security standards, enforce consistent security standards, which means like if you decide I only want people to be able to access my stuff from trusted devices, you can implement that. They can't get past you unless they have a trusted device. You can change up your multi-factor authentication and add the right level of security on that, depending on all kinds of different things. You can do stuff like say, I don't want anyone whose IP looks like it's coming from North Korea to get in. Or I don't want people who signed in 5 minutes ago in Chicago to be able to sign in Hamburg. You can do all kinds of things that you might want to do because everybody has to go past you again. But since I'm using words like the dream and I have this nice castle of cards, you might realize that I don't really think it always works this way. And the reason for that is that if we go right back to what the heck is an SSO protocol, what does it mean to actually implement it, SSO protocols are just a way for your company or hackerspace or personal identity provider to tell a service, a cloud service, yeah, that's Bob. That's all they are. It's just a way to say, yeah, that's Bob. And saying, yeah, that's Bob doesn't guarantee anything I just said. So yeah, I'm giving you this talk because recently, a couple of years ago, I was this optimistic purple blob. And I had heard from people, SSO is a great thing. My security team wants me to do it. My compliance team wants me to implement it. Oh, hey, my key account manager came in their shiny suit and they said, we've got SSO, you can turn it on. So I was just like, great, I'll turn it on and everything's just going to be great. This is a horror movie and you're now all yelling at me not to go into the basement where the light switch isn't working because I'm about to get murdered. Okay, that wasn't quite that bad, right? But I am no longer that optimistic purple blob, although maybe I am in some ways. But I'm this more pessimistic blue blob now. And I've learned that if I want to implement single sign-on properly so that it actually brings benefits, just like with any project of any sort, I should figure out what I need first. What am I trying to accomplish? And then when I know what I want to do, then I need to figure out what my vendor thinks the problem is. What are they solving for? What are they actually offering me? And then critically, these 2 points are not actually enough. When I think I've understood these two, I need to ask weird questions because communication is hard and people make mistakes. It is so easy to have misunderstandings with a complex topic like identity and access management, which is what this is. And you can ask some questions that are not inaccessible, I think, for anybody in this crowd to be able to ask, and you'll make things much better. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to go through these 3 points and talk about them in a bit more detail. So we're going to start out with figuring out what I actually need. I've found in life, as well as at work, before you just start madly running off in all directions, trying to solve a problem, it helps to decide and figure out, at least in basic terms, what am I trying to do? What am I trying to accomplish here? Because then you can go in probably approximately the right direction to begin with and not just waste time running in circles. So to begin with, I came up with 2 fairly simple, I think, need statements for my at least theoretical example. What's my company trying to do? So need number 1, users must sign in through my company. They have to go through me before they get to my stuff. Need number 2 is that once they go through me, I want to make sure that users can only access their own stuff. So Bob here, yes, that's Bob, can only access Bob's doghouse and not everybody else's. All right, I think that's a pretty good place to start with, and you may have different needs, but at least we've got something that we can start discussing here. So point number 2 is what can my vendor do? And before I talk about kind of more specifics, I think it's really helpful to think about how did my vendor get to the point where they were offering single sign-on in the first place? SSO is not the first thing they developed, right? I'm buying stuff from this cloud provider because they're building a cool new internet thing, or like maybe a really solid old internet thing, or maybe they won the EU tender and I have to deal with them anyways, whatever. But I'm not buying their services because they provide single sign-on. They probably built single sign-on, or they may have built single sign-on because a pesky customer like me came to them and said, look, my compliance team is on my back. If you don't have single sign-on by the end of the fiscal year, I can't pay you anymore, so please just let me check this box off, right? And even if they are not panicking and rushing through a minimum viable product that they need to release within 3 weeks, they still probably have different ideas about single sign-on than you do. Because accessing cloud services is not actually super simple. There's a lot of different bells and whistles and levers and different ways of thinking about the problem. And the chances that you are thinking about the problem in exactly the same way that your vendor is are pretty darn low. So let's talk about what kinds of ideas they might have that you might have different ones. So, for example, we've probably all seen create your account pages that look a lot like this. You can either enter an email, which is probably going to be your username, and then enter a password, maybe set up a second factor, or you can continue with Google or Microsoft account or Apple or Facebook or Mastodon or who knows what. And if you choose the second one, then you're basically choosing to set up something with single sign-on. And that can be really convenient for people who don't have a password manager, but maybe don't want to have to set up 17 different passwords. They just choose to use single sign-on and make sure that that one account that they're linking to everything is secure. We can have discussions about whether that's a good idea or not, but it's a great convenience thing for people, right? Oh, I just needed to use your service. Why do I have to make an account? I'll just click here and keep going, right? They might not care about anything or usernames matching between like what's in my identity provider and the service. So if we think about something like YouTube versus my Google email address, I don't really need those two identities to match in any meaningful way. I just want to make sure that when I'm getting into one, I can use the other one to get in, right? And there are a lot of really important reasons. I mean, in the chaos community, we know that using pseudonyms is really important, and having that anonymity is really important. So this is really helpful. But in a work context, I want to make sure that I know which Bob is modifying that document and that it's Bob and not the CEO, or vice versa. So as an administrator in a company perspective, and maybe even in a different organization, I actually want to make sure that at least I can control what's going on and how those accounts are linked. More than that, they might let users change their own information. So not only can Bob choose his own name, he can change it maybe every hour, which, again, is fine and actually super important. Like, I will absolutely take a fight at work and everywhere else that people need to be able to change their names. But I don't want Bob to be able to impersonate Alice now, and maybe our CISO in an hour, and maybe my friend Diane in 2 hours to invite me out for drinks. I want to make sure that if people can change their names, I still have some kind of control, at least in a corporate environment, and people aren't just impersonating each other. They might have good reasons to have different rules. So one of the needs that I said that I had is that Bob should only be able to access Bob's account and nobody else should. But shared accounts are actually often really useful. I mean, maybe you want your executive assistant to be able to help somebody who's fairly high up in the organization manage a bunch of stuff they're responsible for. So yeah, there are probably some really good reasons that people might want different setups than you do. And there's always this fun one here where I have my nice fence here that says SSO only, but there's a little door here where my skateboarding dog can get through the back entrance because all the API access is still only protected by basic auth. And again, this isn't necessarily the worst thing in the entire universe, but at least I need to know that it's happening so that I can make sure that if there is any basic authentication area, that I have hard control over those credentials, and that not every single user whose passwords I thought I didn't have to care about because we turned on SSO and they can't use them anymore. Like, I just need to know where these things exist and make sure that I can control them. All right, so now we know what we need, and we've had a bit of a talk about why the vendor might not have the same idea as we do. So we have some idea of what our vendor accounts, these lovely chickens, look like, and we have some idea of what our own little purple broccolis look like. And thank you to Microsoft, I'm sorry, I know, wrong crowd, but for this lovely clip art. I find it quite entertaining. I need to now translate between chickens and broccoli. Okay, I live in Germany. Ich spreche auch Deutsch. Ich habe als Erwachsener gelernt. I speak German, and I learned as an adult. One of the things that I learned about translating is that you cannot just assume that you understand. Eventually is not the same word in German as it is in English. It is really a good idea to ask questions about all of those edge cases and make sure that you really understand what's going on. Don't just assume. Unfortunately for me, that was point number 3. Ask weird questions, because communication is hard and people make mistakes. So in this section, I'm going to go through the needs that I described and go into them in a little bit more detail. What exactly do they need? And then talk about some weird questions you can ask to make sure that my vendor is actually meeting my needs, or my cloud provider is actually meeting my needs. So need number 1 was that users must sign in through my company. That means I want them to only use my company's sign-in, not anything else. And I want them to always use single sign-on. OK, what kind of questions might I ask about only using my company's sign-in? This first one is funny. Is there a way that someone signing into a different identity provider, say my supplier, my competitor, etc., could get into one of my organization's accounts? This sounds crazy when I pose it this way, kind of in this context. The first time I kind of thought about it, I was like, why? Why would anyone ever want this? I want to have control over my organization's accounts. Why? But then I thought about it for a little while longer. What about those consultants we brought in for 3 months last year? What about the lawyers that we needed to bring in to help us with that court case? Or the people who were doing due diligence work to see if we could sell a certain part or a certain project that we're working on? There are actually really frequently reasons that I might want to do this, that I might say, I can't handle figuring out all of these other people's identities. I need to trust this other organization to allow specific people in. So there are some use cases where you actually want this. The key is that you need to know that it's possible, and you need to make sure that you can control that it's actually people you wanted to come in and not just randos with another identity, right? So you need to make sure that if this is possible, yeah, you can see it, you can audit it, you can set up alerts on it, and you hopefully have some nice logs, and hopefully none of that is an extra premium service that you didn't include in your contract to begin with. So what's the failure case if you don't ask this weird question? Well, turns out that turning on single sign-on for your organization's accounts still allows anyone else with the following 2 things to get in. Thing number 1, any signed-in identity in any other single sign-on setup connected to the vendor. So anybody else who's set themselves up here, any other account, and anybody else who set themselves up. And that might be hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of companies, right? What's the chance that all of those are perfectly benign? There's no attacker in there. And point number 2, the username and password on the vendor system, on the cloud system, for my organization's vendor accounts. What's the chance that none of my users reused a password when they set up that account? Especially since I don't care about that password anymore, I turn on SSO, right? Like, I'm not auditing them, who cares? But if it turns out that because you can sign in from another organization, having these 2 things means that they can link their identity on another organization to one of my vendor accounts. The extra fun thing is, if nobody gets notified when this happens, not you as the admin, not the user, you don't get logs unless you call them and pay them, etc. That would be a really bad situation. So the most important thing is that you need to know what's going on before you turn it on and make sure that you can mitigate any risks that you might have. So point B was forcing the use of SSO. So what weird questions might you have about that? Well, point number 1 is, will you ever fail away from my sign-in? And this, again, seems kind of weird on the first time you see it. It's like, well, I turned on that single sign-on. Why would I ever want anything else? But if your cloud service is actually helping you do something so important to your business, that if your identity provider was completely owned, like we had a really serious incident, but we still need to do that work, I might need to have a break glass in case of emergency account that lets me let maybe 10 people in who I know I can work with IT and get clean machines just so that we can keep things running. And especially if you're working in critical infrastructure or you're working in an extremely expensive construction project, you might need to make sure you do not have weeks of downtime. And this might actually be really helpful, as long as, again, you know the situations in which it'll fail away from single sign-on. You can control them, and you can make sure that what it fails over to is secure enough for you and that you know how to use it in case of emergency. Question number 2, well, remember my little skateboarding dog? What access is enforced for API users? Are they just using basic auth? Are they using OAuth 2? Is there something a little bit stronger there? Or, yeah, how exactly do they all work? So those are the 2 questions that I would suggest. And here's a failure case, again. Oh, and I forgot to explain. I use spaghetti here to indicate that you don't know where your identities end and the vendor accounts begin. So failure case here is that the vendor has done some things I really like. So they have enforced single sign-on using the user interface. So if someone goes to the homepage, tries to sign in, they always go by me. Great. And point number 2 is they gave me full control over API users. So if I have some terrible ancient automation that requires basic auth, and I can't fix it today, at least I know it's that one account, and I'm watching it like a hawk, and everything else I've switched over to something new. But turns out their own phone app can't use single sign-on. So it's still using basic authentication. And, oh, by the way, I can't actually turn that off. All of my users can get through the phone app using basic auth to get in again. So again, all of this fun stuff that I've done on the web front end is really useless because anyone can bypass that just by using or pretending to be the phone app. And again, if the only way to monitor this is by looking at logs, you better hope that you have access to those. So this is a good thing to discuss with your provider. All right, I think that's enough scary nightmares for need number 1. Let's go to need number 2, which is I want to make sure that users can only access their own stuff. So in more detail, that means that Bob can only access Bob's little doghouse, Bob's cloud house. And I don't want shared accounts. So in this at least simplified or theoretical example, I don't want them. So what are some weird questions that you might want to ask about Bob only being able to access Bob's account? So kind of hinting back to what I was discussing before, if Bob manages to get Alice's username and password, because Alice, our dear beloved CEO, has reused that username and password on the Cool Dog site, which got owned last year, so all that authentication information is around, is that enough to get in? Point number 2 is, does the attribute mapping rely on non-user editable fields? This is getting a little bit away from beginner nomenclature, so let me take a short sidebar to explain what the heck is attribute mapping. So attribute mapping, tells you what chicken matches what broccoli, basically. I'm going to check maybe that the name matches. The name on the chicken matches the name on the broccoli. OK, I'm good. I might choose something else. Name, probably in my case, for a corporate account would be great if it matches, but again, names change. Names might not be spelled correctly, so it's maybe not the best choice. But for simplification, you need to have something on the chicken account that matches something on the broccoli account. OK, so that's what attribute mapping is. And what I want to make sure is that it relies on non-user editable fields. And I'll explain that a little bit more in the failure case in a second. And then, you do have some kind of attribute mapping, right? We're making sure something matches between the two. And if you get good answers to the first 3 questions, and they're like, yeah, we have attribute mapping, this, and this need to match, and no, definitely Bob can't get into Alice's account just with Alice's vendor password. What happens if you make an account and you link it up with SSO, and then you change everything you can? Can you still sign in? Just mess around a little bit. Take an hour or so messing around. You might find something that you want you to find and not someone else. So I promised I'd explain a little bit more in the failure case. Let's see if I succeed. Attribute mapping wasn't in the minimum viable product that they needed just to keep getting paid. Honestly, this isn't necessarily the end of the world. So what they decided to do is make a lookup table of usernames on the cloud side, and they're linked to UDPs of my identity provider. It doesn't really matter exactly what a UDP is. Honestly, I'm not really sure I know, but it's something that shouldn't change about your users on your identity provider, and it's basically the information that the single sign-on handshake, one of the pieces of information that handshake will send back and say, yes, this is Bob. And this isn't in itself a problem, because it means that we have a table over here that says, OK, the chicken username, Adina Chicken, can be accessed by the purple broccoli Adina. Okay, as long as these two things aren't going to be changed, I have no problem. But the vendor account username then is editable by the user. Okay, why is this a problem? We have just unlocked a really fun attack. So I just found out that this person, Cal, got hired by my competitor, who I used to work for. I know how my competitor likes to name their users in the cloud system. So I'm going to make an account called Cal Competitor, which is what I know that they're going to call Cal's account when Cal joins, right? So now I have the username on the chicken side of Cal Competitor lined up with the Adina purple broccoli. Sorry, step 2. Then I'm going to link it to the Adina, one of my accounts, so the Adina broccoli, right? So at this point, that's what the lookup table looks like, right? Cal Competitor matched to Adina. However, I now have a user account called Cal Competitor, which means the competitor can't make that account yet. So very quickly, I changed the username to test, test, test. But notice that the lookup table doesn't change when I change the username. So now my competitor makes the account with the username Cal Competitor and gives it all the fancy rights of this person. And I can access it. And no one's going to get notified because this account was already made. So I can get in, and nobody's going to know. This is worse than basic authentication. All I needed to know was the username, and then I can get in. This is a very bad situation. So if this is how things are set up, you need to have some very serious conversations with your service provider and make sure that they're giving you lists and that they're going to set up alerts for you to make sure that nothing like this happens. Okay, so now let's talk about not wanting shared accounts. I don't have any really clever gotcha questions here, just like, hey, do you use shared accounts? Are they allowed? I would suggest making sure that you double check, hey, what about specifically admin accounts? What about robot accounts? Are there any weird side kinds of users that you aren't thinking about when you're thinking about a regular human who might actually have access to, who might actually have a shared account? And if they say they don't, just push them a little bit. And what's the failure case here? It's mostly that you didn't ask, but they do offer shared accounts. And you didn't know exactly how they work, and no one's really getting told about it. So what happens is Alice, my CEO, links the Alice account on my company to the Alice Chicken username. All good. But Alice, again, enjoys the Cool Dog website, and unfortunately reused the password over there. So if Bob can sign into my company and enter Alice's vendor username and password, then we have a second entry on our table here, which links Alice Chicken also to Bob. And because its shared accounts are allowed, and nobody's getting notified of this, now both of them can access that account. So I need to know that I'm looking for this. And maybe even there are logs out there, but if I didn't know, I wouldn't know to look at them. All right. So now to bring you to a very concrete situation that actually did happen, which is the Squarespace/Google domains issue, which I bet some of you have heard about. So what happened here was that Squarespace made some assumptions. So in the far past, Google used to allow you to sell or buy domains from them. They were a registrar. And then, as Google does, they decided they didn't want to do that anymore, so they sold the service and they gave it to Squarespace. And that meant that Squarespace migrated all the accounts over, migrated all of the domain administrator accounts into Squarespace. So far, so good. So domain admin accounts were created for migrated domains. But they weren't completely created yet. They assumed two things. One, that people would sign in immediately as soon as the change happened and make sure that their accounts were properly secured. I'm sure none of you have ever pushed a to-do item to the next day. This is maybe a pretty bad one, but you didn't think that it was that risky, so you pushed it to tomorrow. It shouldn't be so bad, but yeah, okay. And the second thing they assumed was that everybody would use Google single sign-on because they're coming from Google, so why wouldn't they do that? And if they did that, they went the day it moved and they signed in with Google, everything would be great, but they didn't. And Squarespace has what looks like a very familiar login. You can actually make an account with a username and password. So what happened here is those domain administrator accounts existed with the email and without a password set up. So if instead of, when you went to create an account, clicking continue with Google, you clicked continue with your email, it would ask you to create a password. So again, in this scenario, all you needed was the email address for that domain admin. And then you could set your own password, set your own second factor, and then you were the domain admin. There was no email confirmation required because why would we confirm it? We know the email's right. We know the account needs to exist, except if someone else is signing in. And a nice little bonus, once they signed in as the domain admin, they had the domain, which they can already do basically everything. But additionally, domain admin accounts are also Google Workspace admins, so your reseller can help with troubleshooting, which makes sense in a lot of cases, but probably not if you're like a crypto exchange. Yeah, so people lost a lot of money. Yeah, it was a bad situation. So what's the whole point of this talk? Before I actually wrote this talk, I was thinking about making it. I went to an assembly I won't name and asked folks, hey, what do you think? Would you be interested in this talk? Is it interesting? And one person answered me and they were like, oh, why? Misconfiguration is nothing new. This talk is boring. Who needs it? Just do it right. Just do it right, you idiots. But like, we're all idiots at something. Your colleagues, your managers, your key account managers, your SREs, your hackerspace administrators, they might not know that messing this up is easy. Especially the people just involved in commercial discussions. You know, you use your phone to order a bowl of noodles and it's there in 20 minutes. Why would an SSO be different? So, I want to make sure everyone is empowered to tell everyone to ask those stupid questions, because there aren't stupid questions, there are only mean ones. And just don't make assumptions. Try things out. And it doesn't need to take, 4 weeks of pen testing. Just ask a few questions when you're setting things up, and I think you'll be in a much better place. And with that, I'm over time. So ask me your questions if we still have time. Thanks, everyone.
So now time for the Q&A. There will be a signal angel to relay questions from the internet. Are the proper hashtags on the screen? Are they in there? So the proper hashtags are on Mastodon 38c3-huff, like huff, like HUFF.
The magic dragon. No, that's Puff, sorry.
And on IRC 38c3-hall-huff. And you can ask questions in German and English because she's understanding both. Now, the first questions, please.
Here with a question.
Hi, thanks for the talk, but isn't this disregarding the modern perspective of having passwordless accounts where you only create the accounts when you sign up via the single sign-on provider, or skim provisions them, or like?
I actually did skip that part of my notes because I wasn't reading them that closely. You're right, a lot of these problems really come in the situation where your cloud service provider built a whole infrastructure and built all of their user management and everything, and then someone came along and said, we need SSO, and so they used some chewing gum and some duct tape, and they slapped some SSO on top of it. So yeah, if you're using just-in-time and all of your user management is really owned by the identity provider, then this is much less of an issue. Though to be fair, I don't know, I wouldn't be convinced that people never make mistakes in those situations, and certainly still things like shared accounts you may want to have working or may not want to have working. But you're right. If people are designing things with single sign-on in mind from the very beginning, then you're in a much better situation. But a lot of these things are also designed for consumers first, and then businesses use them. And you can't assume that everyone's going to have single sign-on available. So you don't necessarily have that really nice, smooth setup. But yeah, it's better if it's that way. I just think there are more than 2 vendors out there who are doing things the way that I describe.
More questions?
Nice talk, by the way. How are roles managed, or are they managed at all with SSO providers?
It really depends, right? Like, the bare, simplest chewing gum and duct tape kludging on of SSO will not involve anything more than, did your user successfully sign in, and maybe here's the UDP and I'm actually using that. So you might be in a situation where roles aren't managed at all, and that's frustrating because then you still are. You had one of the points about what does SSO offer? Centralized management of users. But yeah, the protocol doesn't define that that has to happen.
Thank you for the talk. So these were some very interesting questions that you asked in the weird questions area, many that I wouldn't have considered. How, did this take you a long time? I guess my question is, how long did it take you to come up with these? Or, was it a process, or was it something that you kind of came up with? What was the process for coming up with this? Was it weeks or months or years or?
That's a really good question. I'm not actually sure how long it took me to come up with all of the possibilities. I feel like I probably realized that I should be testing some of them and then, put my little hacker hat on and spend a few days trying to poke at things and figuring out where the problems might be. And I think in one of the previous times, I think at Elbsides when I gave this talk, some people were saying it would be really helpful if there was an OWASP checklist, because OWASP has a bunch of checklists of different questions you can ask and things you can make sure of when you're implementing various things. But the level that I'm talking about is more, it's kind of less technical. It's more like, what's your understanding of the problem space? So it seems like there isn't something like that, and I didn't have the energy to make something, so I don't know. I think it took me a while, basically, to actually organize things in this way. But hopefully people can shortcut their own process with these questions.
No further questions?
No?
Hello.
Yeah. Right here at the side. You can just use my mic now.
Thanks for the talk. Who do you consider what was the best integration that you've seen? Or what is the vendor that made you happy? With fallback URLs and good logs and everything.
Maybe someone from the audience can answer that question. I really don't have any good examples, unfortunately. I'm very sorry. I'm sure there are many out there. But yeah. I don't know. Anyone have any really good use cases, places where?
Have you ever engaged with threat modeling providers or threat modeling consultants with regards to SSO to actually map out the kind of threat vectors?
I guess what I basically did was the threat modeling on my own. So the unfortunate answer is not yet. We do have some plans. I mean, basically, the part of my organization that I work with is kind of it's not Critis level stuff that I'm working on, right? And there is some stuff that I'm working on that is really important. And those people, I think, are extremely well taken care of. And they're working with our threat modeling team very closely. But I guess it's kind of, as I've grown in my kind of cybersecurity interest and knowledge, I've kind of taken on a lot of this on my own. So yeah, not directly, but I think we actually do have some plans in the coming year to talk more closely with some threat modeling folks and do some, stuff that isn't just me flying by the back of my pants.
Have you come across the MITRE ATT&CK and MITRE DEFEND frameworks that map out some of these attacks?
I have come across the frameworks, but that was really quiet. Can you repeat the last part?
No, I was just asking if you'd come across the MITRE ATT&CK and MITRE DEFEND frameworks for actually mapping out some of the attacks against these SSO providers.
I have come across it, and I haven't actually bothered to go through it yet with these particular things, and I think that would be a really useful direction to go in. So thanks for the point. I think I should put it on my to-do list. Have you done that with any of these kinds of things?
There's many attacks related to SSO and MFA, which all kind of can be packaged together to bypass that kind of outer perimeter controls. So it's a good exercise.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Some further questions?
I don't see any more fingers.
Yeah.
Every time I say that, there are new ones.
Thanks, everyone.
Maybe you answered this, and maybe it's too personal to your company, but did this work out for you in the end?
Yeah, absolutely.
It did, okay.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think the thing about asking questions like this, and maybe it's also the fact that I'm not necessarily in corporate information security, or I don't know. Basically, I find that raising the questions in a really open way has worked really well for us. And wherever we theoretically may have found some of these issues, they don't exist anymore. The vendors are very willing to work with us on it. And they're basically getting free threat consulting. So, they definitely took us up on it. Thanks everyone for being so active at 1 in the morning with all of your lovely questions. I really appreciate it. Is there anybody else?
One last question.
Nice.
Thanks so much for your talk. I was just thinking that what you talked about now was a lot about authentication. Mm-hmm. And I wonder how identity management comes into that, and I feel like that could actually, or I'm wondering if that could solve some of the problems we first
quiet.
have.
Can you?
Sorry.
That's okay. No. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. So I was thinking, I was wondering actually how identity management comes into the picture, and if that could solve some of the problems. And I wonder if identity management comes first, and then SSO, and that you of course cannot replace a whole identity management with just SSO, and if that is part of the problem.
Well, I guess, so from my perspective, the identity management, I think on my company's side was done really well. I didn't kind of touch on any of sort of the IT setup that needed to happen on my side, because we have a big team that deals with that. So we're not flying by the seat of our pants there. It's I'm just working with the key account manager to make sure that the integration between our identity management and their internal identity management system is working. And the problems that I encountered were basically not even that their identity management on their side was broken or that it's broken on ours, it's the connection between the two, right? So the users on the vendor side, I guess the identities equivalent on their side might be fine. It's just kind of how are they matching these identities together that's the problem. And I'm sure that somebody here is telling me that I'm using the wrong words, but I don't think that the problem can be solved basically by identity management on my company's side, unfortunately. Because all the changes were being made on the other side.
Are you finished?
I think so. Sorry.
So, this was OMG WTF SSO by Adina. Thank you, Adina.
Thanks, everybody.